welcome back to another installment of Janus Academy's series on historical analogies. Today we are dealing with the 19th entry in the series. This one is going to be dedicated to Art Nouveau and consumerism. Now we need to explain this term a bit when we're talking about consumerist art and consumerism in general. This is something that receives different appellations and that crosses over into different realms. This is the type of art that some art historians label as new realism and some other art historians label as pop art. And indeed, it is both of those things to a certain extent. What I'm trying to say is that the certain parts of consumerism, the certain artists that partake in this particular stylistical formation also partake in these other stylistical formations, and they share different traits. Now we're going to be addressing some artists here that are explained for all as new realists, and we're going to be dealing with some artists that are mostly regarded as belonging to pop art. And I like to make a distinction between these. One of the reasons why I like to do that is because they have a very different take on reality. They have different take on what art itself is. They require different aesthetics to be properly interpreted. But most of all, they have their own spiritual physiognomies, if you will. Now, when we talk about this, we're going to mention Andy Warhol, a very famous artist that is most commonly associated with pop art movement. And we're going to be mentioning Andy Warhol again in one of our next lectures that is going to be dedicated to pop art. So there's going to be some crossovers here. And the same thing goes to a certain extent when we're talking about Armand. So Armand is mostly labeled as a neo-realist or new realist, but we see him in this particular optics, and we're going to be talking about him in this particular optics. Now, of course, since the title of our lecture is Art Nouveau and consumerism, this is the historical analogy that we're making. We are going to be addressing these two, and we are going to be addressing what Art Nouveau comes after, because we already spoke about Art Nouveau when we dealt with medieval context, when we spoke of Gothic revival, and indeed the Gothic style that comes chronologically out of the medieval era. Now, what we want to start with is this first and most obvious connection between Art Nouveau and consumerist art. It's the notion of luxury. And this is something that is really important, that comes right out of the medieval era, that comes right out of medieval context and Gothic art, because luxury, as we know, is derived from the Latin word lux, which means light. So when we say that something is luxurious, we are really saying that it is luminous, that it's the kind of art that deals with light in all of its symbolical and spiritual aspects. We have this very important idea that is present in Art Nouveau and that is not entirely present in the medieval context, is that luxury is something that belongs to humans rather than to the realm of the divine. When we enter a Gothic church or a cathedral, we truly witness luxury. We witness the idea of wealth that is spiritual in nature. The absolute opulence we'll enjoy if we get to go to heaven, because the interior of a church really is the rendition of kingdom of heaven. Now, what changes dramatically when we go from medieval to a modern context, and then from modern context to consumerist art, meaning after World War II, what changes is this idea that, again, luxury belongs to humans and is something that is man-made. It's something that is, to a certain extent, separated from the divine realm. This could really go along with the comparison we've previously made between a skyscraper and a cathedral, that the skyscraper really is a symbol of wealth as much as the cathedral is, but a wealth that is material. So you don't need to purify and elevate your spirit to get to this elevated position. You need to make money. You need to become wealthy, and you need to stack your wealth. You need to stack your resources. This is what skyscraper stands for. So when we're talking about the connection between Art Nouveau and consumerism, we are truly talking about the idea of luxury. And something that becomes really important is this idea of globally available luxury. Now, of course, we're not going to get into the whole discussion if luxury truly is globally available, if luxury truly is available for everyone. That's a completely different topic, and it has to do rather with sociology and with history than it does with history of art. But this is the premise that was given. This is the promise that was given, rather. And it really has to do with this Saint Simonian idea of the Industrial Revolution that is going to usher in absolute um, equality, ultimately, that is going to usher in absolute wealth that is evenly distributed. We're going to produce so much wealth through the industrial society, through the industrial mode of production, that there will be no classes anymore. Everyone will be a billionaire. So this is something that people who were Saint Simonian and Count Saint Simon himself believed in. And this is something that has to do with Art Nouveau style. A lot of Art Nouveau deals with this. A lot of it is used in creation of luxurious items. If you're thinking about Art Nouveau homes, you are most likely thinking about very wealthy homes, about very luxurious villas. This is not a style that was used for common housing. This is not a style that was used for massive housing, like, let's say, socialist modernism or some other such style. No, this was explicitly used for conveying wealth, for people who used this style as a status symbol. So having a house that's done in Art Nouveau style meant that the owner was very likely very wealthy. If you think about other places in which you will see Art Nouveau applied, you will see it in a lot of very luxurious hotels. You will see it used in casinos, shopping malls, department stores, some churches, which I think is interesting because it goes back to its initial inspiration, and it goes back to its initial context, really, its source context. But what I'm trying to say here is that Art Nouveau is mostly used in context that speaks of luxury, that speaks of very sharp class stratification, and that speaks of wealth. Now, this is interesting, and it connects to consumerist art in an interesting manner, because something happens between the beginning, the first half rather, and the second half of the 20th century. Now, this something that happens is the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, the end of World War II that ensues, and this new division of the world between the Western and Eastern fronts, between the Western industrial, capitalistic, liberal, etc. Part of the world, and then Eastern, which is a Soviet industrially communist, and collectivist, rather, part of the world. So we not only have an ideological division of the world, we also have an ideological warfare. We have something that we call Cold War. And what happens here is that people of the West start growing this immense fear out of the possibility of the Soviet operated, ran, and inspired communist revolution happening in their own backyard. This is something that is facilitated with the great crisis that happened just a couple of decades ago. So we know that there was a great market crash in 1929, that what ensued was the period of Great Depression that mostly took place in the United States of America, but then that influenced all the other first world countries. And that people started growing these ideas of socialism and communism in America. America had a very powerful socialist party, it had a very powerful communist party, and it had a very powerful set of labor unions. So not to get too much off topic here, we are talking about the moment in history where Western powers understand that if they want to keep their societies capitalistic, if they don't want to have a communist revolution happen on their hands, they have to make some concessions. And they start applying Keynesian economy, a type of economy that is involved in large public works, in large investments. It's involved with heavy taxation of wealth, and then usage of that money that was gained through heavy taxation to enhance housing, education, healthcare, and all the other things. So we get to the point of the so-called 30 glorious years, les 30 glorieuses as they call them in France, a period basically between 1947 and 1977 that is also the period where a Marshall Plan started being enacted, and Marshall Plan was a very influential thing in Europe. So what we start having here is this unprecedented period of prosperity that is fueled by the industrial mode of production. And what happens in the United States, because most of consumerist art comes from United States and is indeed inspired by United States, what happens is that everyone can have a house all of a sudden. We've mentioned this already, you can afford a house and a family, and you can educate your kids even on one minimum wage salary, which today seems unimaginable. And so, for the first time in history, it seems, we have this idea that not only decent living, but indeed some forms of luxury are globally available. Now, this was never the case before. We've mentioned that churches were built in such a manner in the medieval period that they convey luxury, but only if you enter the church. If you think about any medieval city in Europe, let's say Paris or Chartres or Rouen, it doesn't matter, it was a very small, dingy place that was not paved, that had this immensely beautiful and large and truly breathtaking cathedral in the middle, but then not much else. Not a lot of things around the cathedral were immensely impressive or impressive at all. And this was pretty much the case, for most of our history. If we're talking about the Art Nouveau period, we're talking about the so-called La Belle Époque, so really the turn of the century, the period that lasted only a couple of decades. It was a very short-lived stylistical formation. We are also talking about the great dispersion and the great concentration of wealth. If you walk around any European city that has Art Nouveau buildings made in it, you will see that's not a very commonly spread phenomenon, that there wasn't a lot of those. And people who made buildings in this style, again, were very wealthy and dealt with a lot of wealth. Now, even those buildings bore a certain kind of promise of luxury. This is why I want to focus specifically on shopping malls and department stores. And this is something that really connects Art Nouveau and consumerist art, because it's all about the consumption. It's all about spending. And it's all about how spending form our lives, how it informs, instructs, and creates our lives. There's a famous work of art from the 80s that says, "I shop, therefore I am." And this is obviously a reference on the famous Cartesian saying, "I think, therefore I am." So this is where the act of thinking is supplemented by the act of shopping. So in this particular worldview, act of shopping, act of consuming is what makes us human. And of course, this then invites a completely different idea of humanity. What is the human being? Why we exist and how? And this opens a myriad of other questions. Now, I want to go back to this idea of the church, that Art Nouveau came out of Gothic revival and Gothic style, and that these buildings that were made in Art Nouveau style were essentially made to look like churches. They used all the elements that came from ecclesiastical architecture. They've used stained glass windows, oval and curved forms. They were very heavily invested in verticality. A lot of them were intentionally asymmetric, etc. The whole idea, of course, was that medieval sense of luxury was being conveyed with all of the spiritual aspects of it. And when we're talking about Art Nouveau luxury, I think the best place to start is really talking about shopping malls. Now, there are two different kinds of shopping malls to be addressed in the 19th century. We have the malls that belong to the beginning of the 19th century, and then we have department stores or malls that belong to the second half of the 19th century. And you can see that there's a clear connection between them, that the ones in the second half of the 19th century that start being built after the Haussmannian reconstruction are a clear continuation and elaboration of the previously existing passages and arcades, especially when it comes to the city of Paris. Now, I want to bring forth a very famous reference, a very important work of art that was made on this topic, that was done by Walter Benjamin, and that was called Project Arcades. And this is a monumental piece of art. It's, writing, really. Really interesting, quite easy to read, so I recommend it to everyone. So what Benjamin does here when he talks about arcades, he is talking about the development of consumerism. He is talking about the development of shopping as activity, and not just any activity, really the activity that defines city living, that informs and structures our entire life. And he talks about shopping as a cultural experience, and we'll get to it as well, a religious experience. So this is another thing that connects consumerism to Art Nouveau. It connects it to this idea that shopping is everything. It's really how we live our lives. It's the essence of our lives. Now, if you remember our previous lectures, we talked a lot about the essence and question of substance and the question of existence in the 20th century. This really becomes the most important topic of many different stylistical formations. We are talking about this premise then that city living in the 19th century, and then of course in the 20th century, because it's all an elaboration of what already happens in the 19th century, heavily revolves around shopping. And there are historical antecedents to this. You could say that industrial capitalism was made possible by mercantile capitalism, that these two have a very strong connection. We already discussed this in our previous lectures. So it's slow accumulation. Now, mercantile capitalism is not quite the same as industrial. We are not talking about the same scope of production. We are not talking about the same usage of resources. And we are not talking about the same capacity as we are in this particular case. So when we get to the industrial mode of production, we have something that happens as a logical consequence. If you produce in an extremely efficient manner, you end up with a lot of goods that are produced. Now, this means that all of a sudden you had way more goods than you ever had in your previous existence. But now you have to do something with those goods. You have to sell them. You cannot just sit on your produced goods. They're not good that way. They don't mean anything. So since you have this immense capacity to produce that comes through industry, now you have to build and develop an immense capacity to consume. Because you create a lot of things, you need to then sell a lot of things. You need to take money you've earned from selling to build more things, to produce and to sell them. And as you can see, this is how economy works. I mean, this particular type of economy, industrial capitalistic economy. Now, the problem with all of this is that people in Europe were poor for thousands of years, if not tens of thousands of years. Very few people had money to spend, money to burn, if you will. And very few people had this idea that they would just consume for consumption's sake. This didn't really exist before the 19th century in that form. So people who found themselves in this particular position, that they were owners of industry, they needed to create a way to drive people to consume. They needed to inspire people to consume. And they needed to basically do it in a very decisive manner. They needed to be very quick about it because the entire society demanded that, because they had this immense capacity to produce. Now, how do we inspire people to consume? Well, it's a whole production, cultural, artistic, intellectual, philosophical, that stood behind it, so as to create a society of consumption. And this is something that was not an easy task because, again, as we said, European people were poor for thousands of years and they were very frugal. If you don't have a lot of money, if you don't have a lot of resources, you don't have a habit to spend, and you certainly don't have a habit to consume. It's quite the opposite. You have a habit to pinch and to save and to be rational and to optimize your money and your resources as much as you can. So, for example, if you have a suit, something to wear, you have one suit in most cases for the rest of your life. If it gets damaged, you will repair it. You will not buy a new one. And now comes the age where reparation of suit would cost more than buying a new one. This is something I can attest to personally. It happened to me many times that I would buy an item very cheaply. Let's say I buy a pair of pants for 10 euros. And then I wear them, and then I get attached to them. I really like them. I like how they look on me. So they get damaged, and I want to repair them. And it cost me, let's say, 30 euros to repair them, because the person who repairs them, they want to be paid fairly for their labor. And I find myself in the situation that it's much more expensive for me to repair these pants than it was to buy them new. So this is the paradox that we find ourselves in the society that is so heavily invested in consumption, that it's easier to produce a brand new item than it is to repair an old one. This was not the case before, when people had more free time and when they had the necessary skills, to repair clothes and then many other things. So you could argue that the entirety of our society moved from us as individuals being capable to fix our own clothes in many cases, or to repair things around our home, or to do any of these things that we now tend to pay other people to do for us. Because as we spoke in previous lectures, we tend to specialize not only in field of art and in field of science and in field of medicine and really any other field there is, we also tend to specialize in any given profession. So this means that we don't have a panoply of skills that we used to have, that we don't really know how to repair a piece of cloth in many cases, and it's much cheaper and easier to buy a new one and throw that one away than it is to repair it and to think about that. So this is a staple of society of consumption. Now, what also happens in the period that precedes the society of consumption and consumerist art, so we're talking about Art Nouveau period now, what also happens with this global promise of luxury, with this spreading of luxury, or rather the idea of luxury, is that clothes, for example, let's stick with this example for a while, are no longer just practical. So you could say that there's this massive difference between clothes that are worn by peasants or clothes that are worn by any professional for work, and clothes that are worn, let's say, leisurely or just in an everyday manner. The difference is that clothes that you wear for work, professional garments or uniforms, are there to be functional. So your uniform will be defined and designed by the line of work you're in. So it's going to be protective, or it's going to be light, it's going to be made of specific materials. And you can say that aesthetics of these clothes are less important than their practicality. So it really is something that Heidegger discussed at great length when he was analyzing a well-known painting by Van Gogh, Peasant's Shoes. He was talking at great length about usage of these shoes and how these shoes exist to serve a certain purpose, and how you can reconstruct the entirety of life of that particular peasant out of that shoe. You can see where it's worn, you can see where it's damaged. You can basically tell everything there is to know almost about the person wearing them by looking at them. And so Heidegger goes into this whole thing of explaining how it's the essence of art as such to reveal us something about ourselves, to reveal us something about the world that we live in, to reach the truth and all of that. So we're talking about a completely different thing now. I gave this example as a contrast to what we're talking about, because what we start doing in the period of Art Nouveau, and then, of course, later at a much greater scale in period of consumerist art, is that we start buying clothes for their aesthetics and for their status signalization, I would say, status symbolism, if you will allow it. We start buying clothes that are not interesting to us for their practical purpose, but they're more interesting to us as a statement. We start using clothes in a completely different manner. Now, we are buying coats, let's say, not to protect ourselves from the cold or from rain or from the wind or any other thing. We start buying coats who are only secondary in their function. We want a coat to tell something about our social status. We want it to say something about our class. We want it to be a certain statement about how we see ourselves, how we see our aspirations. We basically start fetishistically looking at this piece of clothing. It doesn't have to be a coat, it could be a pair of shoes, it can be a belt, it can be whatever, apart from its practical function. So you could say that when you wear a shirt, an ordinary white shirt, it can be something that you purchased for, I don't know, 3 euros, literally, or it can cost thousands of euros. Now, most people will not notice the difference. I mean, I'm probably one of those people that it's a white shirt, but it can cost you a fortune, or it can cost you next to nothing. It's not going to be terribly different. It's still probably going to be cotton shirt, but knowing that it comes from a certain brand will make the world of difference and will mean a tremendously different price. And this is because you don't wear clothes anymore because of their practical purpose. You wear them as your socioeconomic status statement. You want to position yourself in a society in a certain manner. And then this tells you a lot about how you see yourself, and it tells you a lot about how you see that given society, because positioning in society via your clothes is very different than positioning yourself in society in regards to, let's say, your personal courage, which was arguably very important in aristocratic world. It was really about how good of a soldier you were, how good of a warrior you were, how good of a statesman you were. These were the qualities that were appreciated. And everything that came after that was secondary. It was not really that important how much money you have. Some other qualities were more important. Now, we live in the world that we are discussing that is oriented towards wealth, material wealth, and especially something that is especially important for Art Nouveau and consumerist art is the actualization of that wealth. It's the act of shopping, it's the act of spending. So we see that what happens with Art Nouveau and consumerism is the same thing that happened with many different styles and stylistical formations that we were discussing. We have this more global view style that is fairly representative, that is fairly formal, that is anchored in some sort of material existence and some sort of material presence. And then we have an elaboration of that same theme, of that same motivation and impulse, but reduced on a much smaller scale and focused in a much smaller field. Now, you could say that Art Nouveau is, well, very easy to recognize on account of its aesthetics. And its aesthetics really are one way of speaking about luxury and one way of speaking about actualizing wealth. So you could say that Art Nouveau is a very frilly, very ornamental, in most cases very colorful style that carries this message. Now, arguably, this is not the only message it carries, and I don't want to be reductive about this. I don't want to say that it is the only message, because it carries a lot more than that. It deals with eroticism and vegetative eroticism. It's a commentary on the Victorian society. It's a very deep commentary on Freudian school of thought and many, many other things. But we are talking about the way in which Art Nouveau communicates with consumerist art. And in this regard, Art Nouveau is a statement of luxury. It's a very interesting thing to address that many brothels at the turn of the century were designed in this particular style. And this is not only something that has to do with luxury that this style conveys, it also has to do, of course, with eroticism. Now, it's an interesting thing that we bring these two together, that we bring the idea of sexual energy, of eroticism, of all things sensual, and we connect this through to luxury. We connect this to wealth. And we can all think of this very famous saying from the realm of marketing that says sex sells. I'm sure we all heard this before. It's this idea that, again, you think about marketing, you think about something that sells, something that inspires people to consume. Well, it's sex, it's sexual energy. So we'll leave that aside for the moment, but we'll come back to it when we start talking about New Realism and when we start talking about some of the artists that represent this movement the best. So I want to go back to this whole idea of a mall, of a shopping mall in Art Nouveau period. That is the elaboration of what Walter Benjamin was talking about in his project Arcades. He made a very solid and a very well substantiated comparison between a church on one end and between an arcade on the other. Arcade being the proto shopping mall, if you will, the proto department store. Now, he gave a very elaborate explanation of how when you enter the church, you have to perform a ritualistic cleansing. You have to go to the baptistry and take some water, put some holy water on you. You have to do the sign of the cross. There are these rituals, as simple as they are, that speak of your willingness to spiritually purify yourself. And it makes perfect sense because church is a holy place. You're entering a sanctum in a way. You're entering a place with completely different purpose that explicitly does not belong to the everyday realm of mundanity. You are really entering in a spiritual realm. And so you have to spiritually purify yourself. And many churches will have, you can pay attention, a checkered floor. And then you will see the same thing also in many malls, especially in many passages and arcades. Now, what Benjamin is talking about is that at the entrance of these arcades, we have pavement, which we don't have in most of the city of Paris back in the day. So we have this situation that people who walk around the city are walking through mud, and so their shoes take up a lot of mud. So when they get to the arcade, then they meet a person that is situated in front of the arcade. It's called artiste de décrotage, which means unshitting artist. I think it's the best way to translate this. It's a person that's there to clean their shoes. And it's a person that's there to make sure that their shoes do not sully and do not spoil the interior of the shopping malls. So this assumes, of course, a religious value and a religious potency. This whole idea that you have to go through the act of cleansing when you're entering these spaces that have a strong spiritual potency. Now, he goes on to elaborate that it's not only about checkered floors that you can see in churches as well as you can see in the arcades. It is also about windows. And this is a very big and very important elaboration that he gives. And these are one of the best pages of his book, really, is where he is describing the window of an arcade, the shopping window, and he's connecting it to the window of a church, the stained glass window. Now, we've addressed this when we talked about Gothic art previously, that the stained glass window is animated by sunlight and is given its glorious radiance by sunlight. So here we have a window being animated by gaslight first and then electric light later. And the idea is that this window seeks to convey the same or similar kind of holiness that the stained glass window is doing. And he argues that the way we look at these windows that feature goods, purchasable goods, is very similar. It's very akin to how we were meant to observe stained glass windows in medieval churches. So they use light in a very similar manner. Further to the point, he argues that objects that are presented in these windows are presented in a very similar manner to how relics were represented in their glass casings in the medieval period. Now, if we go back to the medieval period and we're talking about relics, we can say that there existed an entire very well-developed market of relics, that people bought and sold these for considerable amounts of money. And that we can really interpret the way people dealt with relics in a very similar key to how they dealt with luxury goods. So this tells you a lot about the profanation and desacralization that is taking place in the 19th and the 20th century, about usage of imagery and aesthetics and the plasticity, rather, sorry, that was associated with holiness and with sacredness, basically instrumentalization of these so as to further consumerism, so as to make people buy and make people consume, so as to create this aura of holiness around the act of consumption. When you buy things, it's like you partake in the realm of divinity, is basically what they were trying to suggest. Now, he goes on to say that these windows are presented as Gothic stained glass windows. The items are given to us as relics. And he argues that the background of those items is, in most cases, made of velvet. So he says that velvet has this very peculiar capacity, this very peculiar trait, that if you touch velvet, it's very easy to take traces. So even a lightest touch will leave a trace on velvet, which invites us very spontaneously not to touch it. Because if we touch it, we will soil it in a way with our presence, it will be immediately visible. So this is another way in which we infuse these items with the air of holiness, because there is this idea of taboo that necessarily surrounds a sacred or a holy object, a sacred or a holy item. So then Benjamin argues that in this particular period, velvet becomes very important for usage in packaging in general, that we have, let's say, casings of things like glasses, or other such items that become made of velvet, which of course takes us back to the religious presentation of these. Now, it all has to do with, again, not only how Art Nouveau comes out of medieval context, not only how it takes ecclesiastical architecture, this is not, aesthetics, but also architecture. This is not just an aesthetic thing, it's also a practical thing. This is all done so as to enhance consumerism. This is all done so as to inspire people to further consume. Now, this is an example that we deal with in everyday life. When we go to malls, we can observe how similar they tend to be to churches. Now, this is nowhere to be seen better than in Galeries Lafayette in Paris, a shopping mall that literally has the structure of a church, that has a dome and that has a cubic foundation. We know that this comes from Orthodox architecture. Before that, it was present in Roman architecture. This is how Romans made basilicas. And it's an interesting thing to address, really, this historical analogy that basilicas for the Romans were very similar to shopping malls, very similar to department stores. They were public spaces where people came to buy and sell things, amongst other things. And then gathering spaces for people that partook in the church started being made in the style of basilicas. Then the entire Orthodox style of architecture was basically made out of this, and we had basilicas in Orthodox ecclesiastical architecture for a very long time, and we still do. And then these churches started inspiring shopping malls. So you see that shopping malls kind of went from basilicas that were originally shopping malls to being churches back to being shopping malls. And it was always the similar structure, the idea of a cubic foundation and of a domed semicircular rooftop. So if you look at this department store, you can see that not only it's Art Nouveau and Gothic Revival, you can see usage of stained glass windows, you can see very floral, ornamental, very elaborate decoration. But you can also see that this whole idea of shopping was made to be, sacred and holy. It's a usage of church aesthetics for a very mundane act. So something that you are driven to do without, the necessity to do it. And it makes perfect sense that we see a beginning of this, consumerism being developed in the 19th century, and then it exploding after World War II because of Keynesian economy and because of everything that was happening in the West. This promise of not only living well and elevated life standard, but also promise of a certain luxury. Because what truly happened in the second half of the 20th century is that ordinary people started living to a certain extent better than kings have lived just a couple of hundreds of years before. Things became available to a regular person that were never available to regular people before. And this is a promise that to a certain extent and in, I would say, limited capacity was made good of. That many people did have television sets, many people did have cars, they did have washing machines, they did have ownership of their homes and many other things. So we also go back to this idea of authenticity that is at the core of both Art Nouveau and consumerist art. The idea of authenticity, as we know from our previous lectures, is incredibly important for the 20th century because it's all about essence and substance and authenticity. It's all about how authentic our life really is. And it's all about how the industrial process separates us not only from nature as an external thing, but also our nature as an internal thing and something that drives us as human beings. Now, you could say that Art Nouveau is quite interesting in this regard because it's deliberately both artificial and natural. Art Nouveau will feature a lot of flowers and both floral and faunal elements, animals and plants and fruits and whatnot that are made of obviously artificial materials. They will be made of cast iron or of ceramics or of porcelain or of many other such things that are obviously artificial, that are obviously man-made, but will at the same time convey nature in all its lushful glory and abundance and, again, apparent authenticity. So Art Nouveau really has this play that it invokes nature in a very important manner, but at the same time it's using industrial materials to convey nature. So we have a bit of a double bind in this situation, that we have both industry and industrial mode of production and industrial materials heavily present, and at the same time we have all these hints to nature and natural authentic existence. Now you have the same thing happening in a lot of new realism, and you have the same thing happening, of course, in a lot of the context of consumerist art. I would say that the main thing about this entire segment is that it's strongly focused on this act of hyper-consumption and what happens afterwards. What happens when you consume an object? Well, you throw it away. It's not important anymore. We have this very important part of new realism art and of consumerist art that deals with consumption in this particular manner. What stays afterwards? Well, a lot of garbage, really. And you can see that a lot of art starts being made of garbage. Now, you've probably seen this happen to this day. There are contemporary artists that even today create their sculptures out of garbage. They create their sculptures out of found objects. They bring them together. And this, of course, always has a very strong political and social statement. It's that way even when the artist is not necessarily aware of it. But it really speaks something of our society being hyper-consumerist. So let's say that Armand is an artist quite famous for creating his pieces out of broken items. So let's say his broken piano is a very famous work of art. He gathers, well, I don't know which other term to use other than garbage. He brings it together and he gives it value. Now, why is this such an interesting thing? Well, it's because we have this premise, again, and this is one of the reasons why it's called New Realism, that art is meant to tell us something about a particular era. It's meant to always be a reflection of humanity in general or in this particular moment. Now, we can argue that art is generally seen as more valuable if it talks about universal issues and if it talks about humanity in general, regardless of its given zeitgeist. But also it functions if it talks about its own time. And these artists are arguing that this particular time, so period after World War II and onwards, is heavily invested in productivity, in creation of superfluous items. It's heavily invested in advertisement, in marketing. Basically, the entire society is there to make us consume, to make us spend and spend and spend more, because we constantly have to spin this wheel faster and faster. We have to buy more so that more can be produced, so that then we can buy more. And if you follow the news in the last couple of decades, or really in the last couple of hundreds of years, you probably saw occasionally that people talk about the economy slowing down and that the economy needs to pick up and we need to constantly accelerate economy, that it's no good if economy growth falls under a certain threshold, then we may be stalling, then we may get to a standstill, then we can go to recession, then we can go to depression. These are all very important topics. We have boom and bust cycles, and we are basically talking about many times not enough things being produced and then not enough things being consumed. I mean, here in France, it became kind of a thing for politicians not to really talk about citizens anymore, but to talk about consumers. Think of that whatever you will. But it's just something that situates itself in an extremely important aspect of our existence and an extremely important aspect of our economy. So you could say that these artists really position themselves in an incredibly important field of action when they deal with a new society. And they deal with this society, I would argue, more interestingly in the, 50s and the 60s and beginning of 70s, when we're still in this expansionist and in this optimistic and driving forward momentum. Then later, what comes in the 80s and the 90s, then the whole thing starts crumbling down and we are far more cynical about it and so on. So I want to give a couple of examples. When we're talking about this hyperproduction, one of the other reasons why people create art in the way they create it is that a lot of ready-mades are being used. A lot of art is being made out of already existing objects. There is this idea that we produce so much that it's pointless for us to create new objects. We just further add to the clutter. No, we'll use whatever already was being made and we'll present that as art. And you can see how this takes us immediately back to Art Nouveau and its question of authenticity. The fact that you will make a very elaborate fruit set as a part of a facade, but it will not be made of actual fruit. Of course, it will be made of artificial materials. So it's something that conveys a lot of questions of authenticity. And that's at the very heart of both of these stylistical formations. It will be a question of utility of an object. It will be a question of the kind of world we live in, thinking about how the individual exists as a reflection of the system it lives in. So if we live in the world that is created out of garbage, well, that means that we too are created out of garbage, because human beings are a reflection of the world they inhabit, pretty much the same as the world is a reflection of human beings. It's a two-lane communication. It's a vice versa type of situation. So if we create mountains of garbage, well, what does that tell about our interior, about our souls, about our communities? I think you can guess exactly what it tells. So there's, of course, as is the case with Art Nouveau, a lot of religious inspiration involved in this, because what we can observe in a lot of this art is really usage of religious symbols, and it's usage of very specific iconography. Now, we're only going to slightly be talking about this in this particular lecture, because we're going to talk about that a lot more when we get to pop art. It's really important. I just want to mention a very famous work of art, one of the seminal works of art of the 20th century. This is Andy Warhol's Campbell Soup poster. Now, you've all seen this. It's been reproduced many times over. It's basically the image of Campbell's soup can. So there's nothing more to it. And it's not something that is interesting aesthetically. It's, again, just a can of soup and nothing more. It's not about how well this soup can is designed. It's really how it's presented to us. It's basically saying that this is the new icon. This is the new holy. This is something that we bow down to, or kowtow to, if you will. This is the very essence of our society, in a very similar manner how religious paintings or icons were the very essence of our society and of our individuality and of our existence before the Industrial Revolution and before the context has changed so profoundly. So what Warhol is arguing with his Campbell soup is that we are looking at an icon. This is the icon that perfectly reflects society of today. Of course, we'll talk in the one of the sequent lectures about how profoundly Andy Warhol was inspired and influenced by Orthodox icons. And this is something that indeed is very, very important. And he uses a fraction of that inspiration here in the way in which he presents this Campbell soup. It's also a question of repetition. This is a very important thing, because this speaks of hyperproduction and it speaks of hyperconsumption. This fact that you no longer have to do a pilgrimage that can be very dangerous and that can take a lot of time to physically be present next to an important work of art or next to an important relic. You don't have to cross the seas and fight pirates and whatnot to be in the vicinity of holiness, as was the case before photography was invented. No, now we can hyperproduce our holy, we can hyperproduce whatever we hold sacred, and we can basically plaster it over every given wall, every billboard, every poster, wherever we find the free spot. We have this veritable hyper-production of the sacred. So if you can imagine, again, icons being plastered around us in the same way that consumer products are, try to imagine that world. What Warhol is arguing is that these objects that we are surrounded by, consumer products, that we are truly visually polluted by, also have this sacred potency. They're also, fetishes. They really have this divine energy to them. And what he is saying is that this entire consumerist society bombards us with this peculiar type of sacred, and that it creates this very new situation that sacred is no longer geographically localized into one building, that is the church or a cathedral. It's all over the place. Now everything is plastered in sacred, which is an interesting assumption. Now, can we say that the sacred is being watered down if it's repeated that much, or can we say that it maintains its initial potency? There's a lot to be said about image and how sacred images are, and I would like to again go back to the example of iconoclastic wars that happened in the Byzantine Empire, where people spend, a lot of time, over a century, fighting a regular civil war over usage of images. So this is pertinent to this lecture and to this discussion, because we find ourselves in a moment where images are absolutely everywhere. It's incredibly easy to produce them. everyone has a camera now. So we make like 20, 30, 50 photographs a day. We don't even think about it. So it's incredibly easy to produce images. And it was incredibly costly and expensive and limited just a couple of hundreds of years ago. So what these people are doing is that they're inspecting not just how uh, consumerism shapes us and how it shapes our existence, they're also inspecting how the world we live in is all of a sudden cluttered with this very pagan take on the sacred, and how we are overwhelmed with these informations. Just think about visual pollution that is created by billboards and by posters. You can see posters everywhere you go now. If you take public transportation, like almost every other or every bus or subway train or a streetcar is filled with posters. It's basically just posters running around. You have many billboards, you have many, well, regular posters. Here in Paris, what is especially disturbing is that when they're renovating a building, they will oftentimes plaster an enormous billboard that is there to cover the facade that's being reconstructed. And that will be a billboard of any, I don't know, in most cases a fashion company, but also some phone companies and whatnot. So this is a veritable intrusion into your everyday life, that you are exposed to this message whether you like it or not. And this is basically world building, quite literally. So when these guys are making art that's made out of trash, in most cases, as is the case with Armand, this is exactly what's happening. Now, I will bring forth an example of Richard Hamilton and his famous just what is that makes today's home so different, so appealing, work of art, where we have this collage, like a composite, I would say, of different images that are glued together, different photographs that represent like a perfect house, or I mean, I would say a very ironic take on the perfect house. So we have this, well, arguably beautiful woman sitting on a sofa. That is a cutout. Then we have this bodybuilder. I would argue back in the 50s when this was made, this was probably a professional bodybuilding physique. And then we have posters in the background that speak of movies. Then we have items that pertain to popular culture. We have something that looks like a sound how do you call these things really? A magnetophone, I guess. So it's a sound device that produces music and sound. We have a can of, I can't really tell what it is inside, but yeah, the whole idea is that this is a home, which is supposed to be another sacred space that is entirely filled with images that have to do with consumer society. It is filled with human bodies that are highly idealized in a very specific fashion and that pertain to very specific aesthetics that is, let's say, hard to achieve. So this is the hyper-stylized reality that we live in. And home is quite specific. Now, we just talked about how streets are plastered with commercials and how consumerism acts on us when we enter the street, but street is always a public space. So you could say you can expect anything in a public space. You're kind of expecting it to be that way. But if you get to your private space, if you get to your home, you have some sort of a sanctuary in your home. But this work of art is arguing that, no, we don't, really. We are exposed to this tsunami of advertisements even in our own home. And even inside our own home, we are the image of the world that we live in. So we have this guy who is obviously very muscular, very sculpted. He is posing rather than casually walking around. So this is a bodybuilder, I would argue, in the middle of a competition. And then we have a woman who is obviously also posing. Now, she is not in a spontaneous, relaxed, etc. Position. No, she is basically, let's say, in a position of a film star or a model or some other highly artificial, highly stylized profession. So if you put all of this inside a home, this tells you a lot about the authenticity of that home, of how authentic it is, and what kind of living are we exposed to. Now, if we talk about this, we're talking about the sacred and indeed sacral capacity and potency of a home. We want to go back and connect consumerist art further to the religious context and to religious capacity. We want to say a couple of words about Bruce Newman and his neon installations, how he plays with neon that obviously, again, has to do with light, and we spoke extensively about light, but it has to do with light in a very peculiar manner. We associate neon mostly with, again, ads, with logos, with signs that are there to advertise or signal a place of business. So we have this idea that neon is, and correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps this is a subjective take on things, but it's kind of cheap. It's really used, I would say, almost in an ironic fashion. We don't really have a lot of serious neon signs. It's not like if you think about neon, you think about wholly elevated and highly sophisticated, highly elegant things. No, you think about something that is kind of trashy, really. And of course, Bruce Newman uses neon in exactly this capacity because he wants to invoke the society that is bereft with these qualities. Now, we can say the same thing about Liechtenstein, another famous artist that we won't have enough time to discuss here because we are slowly running out of time. We have the question of authenticity that I want to bring forth when it comes to Liechtenstein, and I want to bring it back to Art Nouveau and its question of authenticity, because Liechtenstein famously does not make his own comics. He is taking, and this is quite funny actually, but also terrible, he is always taking comics from one particular comic book artist that he never paid a single dollar to in his entire life. He would take these because they were, well, just there to take, and he would expand them, and he would make very slight alterations, and then he would sell them for, well, millions of dollars. And yes, the artist who actually drew these never saw a dime out of it, nor was mentioned as such. And this is obviously a very strong statement. This speaks of authenticity of this work of art, or rather the complete absence of authenticity. If we're talking about the world that is made of trash, that is filled with trash, well, it speaks of the world that is past authenticity, or rather post-authenticity. And in the same way, I want to interpret famous Robert Indiana love sign. This is something that you've seen all over the place in many souvenir gift shops or just gift shops. This very, very famous, installation, I would say, love in 4 letters. There's a variation of this. It's hope. Now, you could say love, hope. These are beautiful messages. Pretty banal, but whatever. It gets even more banal if you put it in this particular context. If you say that Robert Indiana belongs to consumerist art, it belongs in the same context with Armand and Liechtenstein and Warhol and other people who specifically, intentionally deal with trash. And you say, okay, these highest of ideals, love and hope, are basically connected to this particular context. And you can then bring it back to Art Nouveau again, because you can say that Art Nouveau was very scandalous and was very troublesome when it appeared. People found it to be a bit trashy, not just because it was used for brothel design, but also because it was very explicitly erotic and because it was very provocative. Now, we have a lot more to say on this topic, but we are past our hour, so I will conclude it with this. I hope this made sense. I hope the connection between these two eras is clear. I thank you for your attention, and we'll catch up soon. Ciao.